Today I'm going to show you how to lift your Gen 1 Raptor. If you're tired of the stock ride height of your Raptor and you're ready to lift that beast up, you're going to want to look at this 4.5-inch lift kit from Rough Country. This is Rough Country's 4.5-inch lift kit that'll fit the Gen 1 Raptor. It includes the Crossmembers, the knuckles that are extended for the ride height that you're going with, spacers for the shocks, and spacers for the rear suspension, all the hardware you need it, and all the brackets to install it. So let me show you how to install this on your Gen 1 Raptor. We're going to start our install on the front of the truck. We have to remove this knuckle and remove this shock. So to start this, we're going to remove our caliper. Remove the two bolts that hold down your ABS and your brake line. One's an 8mm and the other one's a 10mm. Then let's remove our caliper. We're going to remove the whole assembly. It's a 21mm socket. There's two bolts on the back. Once you have your bolts removed, slide the caliper off the rotor. Once you have the caliper bolts removed, just tie it up out of the way so it's not pulling on the brake cable. Since we daily drive our truck, our rotor is stuck to our knuckle, so luckily Ford made these two bolt holes. All we have to do is put two bolts in, you tighten them down, it presses against the knuckle and pushes the rotor right off. Tighten them down equally so it doesn't make it go sideways. And there we go. Remove the three 8mm bolts holding the dust shield down. Remove the ABS sensor. It's a 5mm Allen key. Just be careful with them. Sometimes they rust in. Just take your time, wiggle it out, and it'll come out. Luckily, this one was really greased well. Remove your tie rod. It's a 21mm nut. Once you have the nut removed, smack the side of the knuckle to break the tie rod loose from the knuckle. Put your nut back on so you don't lose it. Next, we have to remove the dust cap to get to the axle nut. Be careful with it. It's very thin. You can crush it. And there we go. Wiggle it loose. Grab a 13mm to take the nut off. Remove your upper ball joint nut. It's a 21mm. Do not take it fully off. Make sure the nut's loose enough where you can take it off by hand. Then you can smack the knuckle to break it loose from the upper control arm. Just do a good hit on the side of the knuckle. I'll pop it loose. Hold down on the upper control arm, and then you can loosen your nut, and then slowly release. Remove the three 8mm bolts on the vacuum actuator. Wiggle it and pop it loose from the seal, and then you can pull your axle out. Remove the four 18mm bolts that are holding on the hub. Leave two bolts lightly in, and then take a hammer, lightly tap it to help push the hub out. Once the hub's loose, take out your bolts. Next, we have to remove the lower ball joint nut. It's a 24mm. Take your nut off, take the knuckle out. Put the nut back on so you don't lose it. We have to remove our shock. We're gonna start by removing the big giant nut in the bottom. It's 1 1/16 inches for the bolt head, and then I use a big old crescent wrench to hold the nut. Remove the sway bar link from the sway bar. It's an 18mm. You might need a socket or wrench to hold the joint because it might spin. Remove the nut, make sure it's loose. Then let's remove our lower control arm. To remove the lower control arm, you need an 1 1/16 socket for the nut and a 21mm wrench on the bolt. Do not remove the bolt until you have the other nut off. Once you have both nuts out, you can pull the bolts out. To remove the shock, there's 3 15mm nuts you have to remove. Before you remove your last nut, grab a hold of the shock so it doesn't fall, and then you can take your nut off. Once you have everything removed on this side, repeat the same process on the driver's side. All right, now we're under the vehicle. We're gonna start by removing the sway bar, skid plate, and then get the diff out. Take a 15mm socket to get the sway bars off. Once you get the nut removed, remove the skid plate out of the way, and then take the nut off. Remove the 6 15mm bolts holding the skid plate on. If you have an OEM bumper on your truck, you might have to remove the front skid plate, but since we have an aftermarket one, we'll have to move on without it. Remove the 4 bolts that's holding on this brace with a 15mm socket and 18mm wrench. Once you have the bolts out, just pull down on it. Remove the dry shaft bolts. They're 10mm, there's 6 of them. Just grab yourself a screwdriver to hold it in place. Once you have all the bolts out, lightly tap on the housing and then the flange just to break the seal loose and get the dry shaft out of the way. All right, now what we're gonna do is play some arts and crafts, cut out the template that they supply, make sure the measurements are exactly right. You might have to go send it to your printer, get it rescaled to the right measurements that they have on the thing. All right, so there's 2 different templates. One's actually bigger than the other. With the smaller one, you're gonna flip it, lay it up here, and then we're gonna tape it into place. Line it up with your holes in the bottom and line it up with a hole in the top. Tape it, and then repeat the process on the other side, and then we'll start cutting. All right, once you have the templates on, put some safety gear on and start cutting it off. All right, now that we cut this one chunk out, we still have to cut a lot more, but we have to go up. So before we can do that, we actually have to remove this diff. There's 3 18mm bolts, 1 on the passenger side and 2 on the driver's side. So let's get them out and get this diff out. Do not take the bolts out yet until you're fully ready to remove the diff. As you can see, we have a lift jack here to hold the diff while we take the last 2 bolts out. Remember to keep those bolts. We're going to be reusing them. Remember to disconnect your vent hose. Oh guys, so this is one hard part to show you on camera. But to get the top diff bolt out, this bolt right here, you have to remove the bolt on the steering knuckle, pop the steering knuckle off. Remember to have your steering wheel locked so that it doesn't turn or damage the clock spring. Pull that off, and then you can get your top bolt out for the diff and get the diff out. All right, now back to this big old bracket. We have to cut some more out so that we can fit the whole trusset into place. We have to go from here up to here. We have to go right across, cut through this bracket, and then right across to the other side. And then down. Cut that out and we can get the trusset in place. Oh, the last thing we have to do is drill out the hole on this template. We're going to start with a small drill bit and then go to a 5/8. Grab the supplied diff extension bracket, slide it in the upper mount, grab the factory bolt, slide it in place. And then lightly snug it down. Install the passenger side diff mount bracket with the pocket pointing out. Slide your bolt in, slide your factory nut tab back on, and then lightly snug it down. Do not tighten it until the diff is in. All right, now we have our brackets in place. Grab the supply bolts to slide in here, place your diff in, and bolt it down. All right, now that we have our diff in place, but still loose so we can move it around, we can put our rear cross member in. We have to put the rear cross member in with the sway bar mount as one piece. Grab your rear cross member, slide it into the passenger side first. Hold it up with your shoulder or with an extra person. Slide your sway bar mount into place using the factory location holes. And then grab your 18mm bolt, slide it all in as one piece. And repeat the same process on the driver's side. You might have to lightly tap up the cross member to get it over the joint on the differential. This is the driver's side sway bar link, where the location for the cross member will go, and this is where the bolt for the differential third mount will go. So get this all in place. We'll put the bolt in for the cross member, and then we'll work on getting the bolt in the differential. Put your nuts and washers on. Now let's get this last bolt in for the differential. You're gonna have to work with the cross member and the differential, slide them around to get it all in place. Use a hammer to lightly tap it in. All right, as you saw, I had this differential all bolted into place and held in place to help get the cross member in. Now I just lowered the passenger side because we have to put this differential brace in for the passenger side. So what we're gonna do is slide it in, slide the supplied bolt through the brace, slide your diff back up, slide your bolt back in, and then we'll bolt the brace down to the cross member. Grab bag 3 for your diff brace bolts. Assemble them with bolt first, washer, slide it into the brace, and then wash in the nut. Reinstall your factory sway bar nuts on the factory studs. Do this on both sides. Once you get the nuts on, you can tighten them down. Install your diff vent hose. Then let's reinstall your steering joint. Slide your steering joint back on. It only can go one way. Put the steering bolt back in and then torque it down to spec. All right, now that everything's in place and bolted into place, we can start torquing all our bolts down. We're gonna start with our original diff bolts to 90 foot-pounds. All right, now that we have the bolts torqued, what I like to do is after I know it's torqued, put a paint mark down, knowing that bolt's done and torqued, and then later on you can check to see if the bolt has moved. The 3 diff bolts get torqued down to 100 foot-pounds. All right, now since we're not reusing that mid skid plate, we just took the clips off of it. These little clips right here, you just pull with a screwdriver and it pops right off. Grab your skid plate extension, slide the clips back onto the new piece. And then we're gonna slide it onto our skid plate and bolt it down with the factory hardware. Now, if you had the factory skid plate for the front, you'll have to trim it to make it fit for this skid plate and Crossmember. Tighten all 4 bolts down with a 15mm and then torque them down to 32 foot-pounds. All right, next thing, install your front Crossmember. That Rough Country logo goes to the front, showing a great company. Install it with the factory hardware. Put your nuts on. Do not tighten it down yet. All right, now we're gonna be putting our beefy control arms back on. Rough Country supplies canned bolts. Once we put them in, do not tighten them down. Repeat the same process of putting this control arm on the driver's side. Grab your hardware bag, number 2, and the supplied skid plate. Let's get this installed. Grab 2 3/8 1-inch bolts with washers. There's already nuts in the Crossmember, so you just have to bolt them in. Do not tighten them down yet. Grab 2 more 3/8 1-inch bolts. Bolt the front of the skid plate. Put washers and then nut. Once you have your skid plate in place, you can tighten down your bolts, torque them down to 35 foot-pounds, and then we're going to tighten down and torque down our Crossmember bolts to 191 foot-pounds. Tighten and torque down your diff brace to 55 foot-pounds. When lifting your truck, the dry shaft gets farther away from the diff. Rough Country made this nice adapter so that you bolt up to your diff. Once you slide this adapter on, the dry shaft can bolt right up. Line it up with the diff flange and lightly tap it on. Now with the adapter in place, take the brace off your factory dry shaft bolts, then grab the new bolts, the M10 by 80mm, slide them into place, put some blue Loctite on, and then tighten them down. Next, we're going to be installing our brake line extension brackets. We have to remove this 10mm bolt, bolt the bracket in, and then we can bolt the stock bracket to the new bracket. There's 2 sides of the bracket. We're going to be installing the bracket with a single hole onto the factory location using the factory bolt. Bend your factory brake line so the bracket fits in the new bracket location. Grab a 5/16 bolt with washers and a nut. Slide it through. Go ahead and tighten those down and then repeat the same process on the other side. All right, onto assembling the shock. We have to take these two spacers off, put the supplied spacer from Rough Country on, and then bolt these spacers back down. Slide on the spacer and bolt it down with the factory nuts. Tighten it down with a 15 wrench or socket. After you bolt down your big spacer, put the factory spacer back on, and then slide your shock into place. Lift your shock into place. Grab the other spacer. Grab the supplied nuts. Do not tighten down these nuts until you have the shock bolt into place in the control arm. Then you can tighten everything down. Lift your control arm into place. Get the holes lined up. And then slide the massive bolt back in. Torque the shock nuts down to 35 foot-pounds, then the lower bolt to a factory spec. Repeat the same process on the driver's side, and let's move on to our sway bar. To install your sway bar, grab the supplied 3/8 1-inch bolts, slide them in with a washer. Grab your sway bar. Once you have the sway bar in place, torque down the bolts to 35 foot-pounds. Install the factory sway bar link nut and then torque it down to 55 foot-pounds. Alright guys, so the last thing we have to assemble is the new knuckle. With the new knuckle, they actually changed the ratio of everything because we're lifting the truck but also lowering the differential. The top of the spindle is taller to reach the upper control arm with the height that we raised the truck, and the steering arm is raised so we can reach the rack. So let's get it assembled. Slide your hub into place. Line up the holes, put Loctite on the bolts. Once you have all the bolts in, torque them down the spec in a cross pattern. Install your vacuum actuator with the ports pointing up. Tighten them down with an 8mm. Repeat the same process on the other side. Alright, now that our spindle is all assembled, let's get it on the truck, put the axle in, get the control arm bolted, and the caliper bolted. Grab the knuckle, slide the axle through while putting it in the lower ball joint. Once you have your axle in place, put the nut on. Push down on your upper control arm and put the nut on. Then go ahead, tighten down the upper ball joint and the lower ball joint. Before installing your axle nut, you're going to want to measure from the end of the axle shaft to the bearing. Make sure it's 15.5. If your axle is not at the right length, wiggle the axle around or actuate the actuator to get it right in the right place. Torque the axle nut down to 30 foot-pounds. Reinstall your tie rod. Reinstall your ABS sensor, and then your dust shield. Reinstall your rotor and caliper. Put blue Loctite on the caliper bracket bolts, and then torque them down to 140 foot-pounds. Good, now the last thing for the front. Plug your vacuum line back in, tighten down all these clamps for the wires, and then finish the other side, and let's go to the back. We're gonna start by relocating our brake lines. They give you a little bracket. So what we have to do is remove this 10mm bolt, put the bracket in, and it lowers this brakes, and then we'll start on the e-brake cables. Give the assembly a little bit of a twist and a pull it down a little bit. Grab the new supplied bracket, bolt it into the frame. Then before tightening, bolt the bracket to the new assembly. For the bolt you need for the bracket will be in bag 4. Tighten the new bolt with a 1/2-inch wrench and a 1/2-inch socket. And then tighten down your 10mm bolt. Onto those e-brakes now. So we have to relocate these e-brake cables with the bracket that they supply. To get them out, squeeze the blue tab. This one will pop right out. And then for the second one, grab a pair of needle nose pliers, push in the tabs, and it'll pop right through the hole. Pop the e-brake cable off this bracket. Just pull on it a little bit, and it'll slide right out. So we have to measure for a new hole that's gonna be mounted for the bracket that we have to drill. What we have to do is mount the tape measure right to the face of this plate, measure 1 5/8 to here, put a little dot right there, and then 1 3/8. Once you have your mark made, drill out that hole. Drill your mark with a small drill bit, and then drill it out to 11/30 seconds. Put your bolt in, and then tighten it down. With the 5/16 bolt in place, put the 7/16 bolt right here on top. With a washer and a nut. Go ahead and tighten that one down too. We'll reinstall these e-brake cables after we're done putting the spacers in the truck, so let me show you how to put those in. All right, now you have to remove the lower part of your shock. It's an 18 and a 15. Then to get the U-bolts off the axle, it's a 21mm. Remember to support your axle when you're taking out your U-bolts. We won't be reusing any of this anymore. Alright, so there's a slight difference in the two blocks. They're angled, and then there's a flat side. So the angled part will be pointed towards the back, and this will be pointed towards the inside. Place your lift block back into place in the locating pins, and then lift your rear back up. Remember to get it lined up with the leaf spring pins also. Grab the factory flange, slide it on the new U-bolts, and then grab the supplied nuts and torque them down to 90 foot-pounds. Tighten them down equally. Rough Country made the combinations for these anti-wrap U-bolts. You put them right in, and bolt them down to 45 foot-pounds. Slide your shock relocation bracket into place. Put the supplied 12mm bolt in. On the back side of the shock bracket, we're going to be installing this 1/2-inch bolt with a square block. Slide it through, put a washer in and then a nut, and then tighten it down to 90 foot-pounds. Try to keep the square, leveled. Install your factory shock bolt. After you got the bolt in, torque down everything, and repeat the same process on the other side. Then the last thing we have to do is hook up our EBrake cables. Slide the cable through the hole. Make sure it clicks in. Slide the blue part, had the slot sticking out, clicks in. Slide your cable through the notch, and then your installation's complete. Oh yeah, everyone, as you can see, we just finished the 4.5-inch lift kit from Rough Country. Really changed the stance of this truck. It was very easy to install. Give yourself a good weekend with a friend of yours to help you get everything in place. It takes a little bit of time and a lot of tools, as you can see. For this lift kit and many other great parts, go to cjponyparts.com.